a future-ready curriculum, a new paradigm for medical education. We'll come back later to the note of the nut in the tube. I think it's great to have an opportunity to take part, and I'm very grateful for this very important AMEA meeting on the fourth industrial revolution and its implications for the health professions education. We had the first industrial revolution with mechanization, water power, steam power, the second industrial revolution with mass production, assembly line, electricity, the third industrial revolution with computers and automation. And now we've got the fourth industrial revolution, physical, digital, and biological technologies. The fourth industrial revolution bringing together these three clusters of activities. The physical technologies, 3D printing of human organs, for example. Digital technologies, for example, augmented virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and biological technology, genetics and genomics. These three collections of activities. And we see this in our day-to-day life. We came to this meeting from another meeting in Korea, in Seoul. And when I arrived departing from Seoul airport, I was met by an example of this. This book talked about we're on the verge of a fourth industrial revolution that will radically change the way we work and live. Just published last October, will radically change the way we work and live, what we experience in our day-to-day life, even at airports. When I arrived at the airport, I was met by this robot who said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "We're going to Malaysia. Where do we check in for the Malaysian flight?" And it replied, "Follow me closely and I'll take you there." We followed it and took us to check-in desk 8. And when we got there, it said, "We're now at the Malaysian airline. I hope I was able to help. Have a good flight." So this is not the future, this is today. In this report, How Doctors and Patients Can Win, Alan Myers, who's president and CEO of the Society of Physician Interpreters, said, we must change how we educate and train the future workforce. We must change how we educate and train the future workforce. We know in terms of technology and medicine, Bertrand Mesco talked at the AMEA meeting last year about the many technologies. He talked about that exist in science fiction, but already now existing in medicine. And this year's report from the Open University on new pedagogies picked one of the 10 important pedagogies, robots in learning. So this is with us. There was a report to the British Parliament on this fourth industrial revolution. And the argument was that we should be using more about artificial intelligence in education. This was Anthony Seldon's comments.
Let me tell you very, very clearly, British government understands to some extent AI in transport, AI in retail, AI in health sciences and other areas. It does not begin to understand the impact of AI, for better or worse, in education.
We need to use more AI in education. But how are we responding to these challenges in our medical schools? Responding to the opportunities of the fourth industrial revolution? I think that's the challenge of this meeting, for us all to think about this. How are we responding to these challenges? Are we thinking just on the status quo? We've trained doctors for many years, why bother to change? Or are we just saying, well, we'll make simple, modest changes in response to these? Safe practice. We had a featured issue of Medical Teacher last October looking at the future medical school, and Richard Hayes said this, that most new medical schools tend to follow convention pathways. They develop similar programs that provide similar student experiences, often as a safe pathway to be accepted by potential applicants, professions, and accreditation bodies. We play safe with our students, the profession, and accreditation bodies. It's almost like we take a picture like this old lady and we finally tweak it a little and make it into a much more attractive. But maybe there's not much change. So do we simply want to stop with these modest changes? What I think the challenge of this meeting is to look at more fundamental change. More fundamental change, more significant change as a result of this fourth industrial revolution. And I wanted to highlight, for me, 6 features of this change. 6 challenges we all face. I think the first is the move to adaptive learning. At the moment, in many of our schools, it's really one size fits all. But we know in medicine we don't do that. When I was treating thyroid patients, every thyroid patient got their own special treatment. Some got thyroidectomy, some radioiodine, different doses, some antithyroid drugs. But we treat all our students much more the same. I think we'll see much more move to adaptive learning, where personalized learning for each student. Moving away from this model where students come into our medical school and go through this factory and all get the similar program. We don't spend enough time thinking about the individual requirements for each school. So I think we will see much more adaptive learning in the future, made possible by many of these changes, made possible by artificial intelligence, by robots, by virtual reality. That all contribute to this. In Science Daily, it featured about robot learning improving student engagement and adaptive learning. Learning analytics, getting more big data information about our students, will help us to tailor the program to our students. Rachel Evelyn made this point in our article in Medical Teacher, developing the role of big data and analytics in health professional education. This will help us to individualize the education for each student. And I think we also understand now, this is already happening, understanding of learning. In Dundee, for example, here's 2 of our students working together in a self-learning program on the cardiovascular system. They're tutored at a distance, although there are good cardiologists obviously also in Dundee, by Ira Gessner in Florida. And they have a number of choices. They can decide, do they want to work individually or as the student did in pairs. They can choose to assess themselves at the beginning or the end of the program. They can read the text or listen to audio. They can listen when are they going to study and for how long, what depth of study are they going to look at the cardiovascular system. So personalized learning is already here, but with these new technologies, it will become more part of our daily program. So adaptive learning. The second is already with us, but will become more embedded in our program, the move to outcome and competency-based education. The move away from thinking just about the process, how many lectures should we have problem-based learning or whatever, to much more looking at the product, what sort of doctor are we training, and the move to competency-based education. And I like this very simple formula. Competency-based education is mastery learning. We'll make sure that all students will achieve the mastery, all postgraduates will achieve the mastery, plus adaptive learning. They'll do this in their own way. And I think it's an interesting way to think about competency-based education. Adaptive learning, learning in their own way at their own time. The problem is at the moment, what's fixed, and it makes no sense, what's fixed in our curriculum is time to training is fixed. It's a 4, 5, 6-year course. We allocate, spend 2 hours in the simulation laboratory. And what's variable is the standard students achieve. What I think we'll see more of, and it's difficult to organize, but will become possible, that what's fixed is the standard students achieve, and what's fixed, what's variable is the time. What McGahey showed in Chicago, even the simulation laboratory, some students master it in half an hour, others need 3 hours to master the same thing. So what will become fixed is standard, and what becomes variable in time. And even postgraduate training, Richard Resnick in Toronto showed that in orthopedics, to train orthopedic surgeons, what matters is the quality of the surgeon. Some can achieve in 2 years, some take 3 years, some take 4 years. All achieve the same standard, but what's variable is the time. Outcome-based education. The third area I think we'll see much more about is the continuum of education. At the moment, we've got these almost silos, fixed silos, basic medical education, postgraduate, and CPD. And in one of the articles in this series in Medical Teacher, Dave Davis said it's the removal, or at least the increased porosity of the artificial barriers between undergraduate, postgraduate, and continuing education. We'll remove these barriers between these different phases. A much more seamless connection, an extended curriculum across all phases, clearly identified learning outcomes at each stage. And students may progress at different stages. We're already seeing that in some schools. Students leave the basic education earlier and go into postgraduate training a year earlier. And the World Economic Forum addressed this problem in general. It said, there's something else we need from a fourth industrial revolution education system, the full embrace of the concept of lifelong learning. It isn't just learning in our medical schools, university, it's lifelong learning. We need to be more emphatic about making it a reality. Rather than a nice add-on to our current formal education system, it should be the concept around which the entire system is understood and organized. And that's a challenging thing. When we're planning our education program in our medical, we think about the 4, 5, or 6 years. We shouldn't be thinking that. We should be planning it, integrating it as part of, these are going to be learners for the rest of their life. A concept around which our whole system should be built, this notion of lifelong learning. Adaptive learning, outcome-based education, the continuum. The fourth area is this notion of unbundling the curriculum. And for many, this may be strange, but it's certainly already with us and will become more dramatic. In this article on the implications of the fourth industrial revolution, it talked about moving from a centralized to a decentralized production. Single universities won't do everything they need. After all, in car factories, no car factory produces all the parts they need for their own cars. They buy them in, and the same should be true in education. We need to move to a decentralized model. In other words, it said, the idea of consistent digitization, linking of all the productive units, different universities in the economy is emphasized. So we should all work together more, was the suggestion. And in University World News, in 2017, a couple of years ago, it featured this notion of university and experience, an unbundling revolution. It said it's the biggest change that's happening in universities is unbundling. Big breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately needed. It said we need to collaborate, and the fourth industrial revolution is making it possible. Schools don't need to provide all the elements of the curriculum. They're not self-sufficient. Schools should work together with other schools to provide the necessary range of learning experiences. And students may have then elements of choice. And to a small extent, I suppose that's what's happening already at IMU. In an interesting book by Ryan Craig, College Disrupted, he said, this is a gripping vision of the likely immediate future of higher education backed by hard data and insider insights. He said, this is already happening, and it's a key part of the fourth industrial revolution, the sharing industrial revolution, where schools don't work. We're not swing fencing each school, self-committed to everything they need to do. That's the past. The future is much more collaboration between schools, nationally and internationally. And again, another article in World News highlighted this notion of outward higher education, internationalization. It even talked about this fantastic notion of modular programs delivered across a network of global schools, designed to take advantage of the specialties of each location. So each school had its own special things to offer. But students were admitted to the network, not to a particular campus, and could move frequently around the network locations. So an interesting notion of the future of medical education. And the fifth is the students, the key part, of course, of our process. And Richard Hayes, in his article in Medical Teacher, talked about the different impact on the students of how they learn, particularly artificial intelligence. We'll have a comprehensive profile of every student. We'll know how they're learning. We'll know about their personality, about their temperament, their emotional strengths. And then he went on to say, we also need to know how each student will need support. And each student will have a personal support tutor. It's an electronic personal support tutor who provides one-to-one support for the students. And he even added, there'll be an urgent button to press if immediate support is required. David Gurin, in his book, Future Driven, talked about the adaptable learners. Students will be different. The future student, well, not someone who just mastered ABC and whatever. It will be someone who's an adaptable learner. An adaptable learner. I think at the moment, too much of our focus has been just-in-case learning. You've got to learn all of this, because after you qualify, you may need to know it. Just-in-case learning. And I think we're seeing a big move in the future to just-in-time learning. Students will know how to learn when they need to learn something. In the book, The Practical Guide for Medical Teachers, Chuck Friedman and his colleagues talked about this. Look, 3 things they say we don't do enough in medical school. First of all, we should teach our students how to ask the right question. We should teach our students how to identify sources of information. And we should teach students how to evaluate the answer. He said, that's what we need for the future student. The student who leaves our medical schools needs to know how to ask the right question, how to get the information, and how to evaluate it. Because we can't teach them everything they need to know in medical school. I think we're seeing a change of the student's role from being a client to being a customer or consumer to being a partner. Students being partners in our education process. Students being partners in the education process. And this is recognized in the Aspire initiative, where one of the 6 themes where excellence is recognized in medical schools is student engagement. And I'm delighted that IMU actually got the Aspire Award for student engagement. Of course, some students may not be attracted to some of these changes. This was one protest where the Brooklyn students had a walkout in protest about Facebook-designed online program. This is what happened. The Brooklyn teens are protesting about the high school's adoption of an online program spawned by Facebook, saying it forces them to stare at computers for hours and to teach themselves. So we have a difficult job selling this also to some of our students. And the final area is the teacher's roles. As teachers, we will continue to be key element in the ingredient of our success of our program, but we have a changing role. And Pat Whaley and I highlighted this in our book. Just a small commercial, I think it's available in the Elsevier stand outside if you're interested. And we talked about these 8 roles of the teacher: information provider, facilitator, curriculum assessor, role model, manager, scholar, professional. I won't go into these, but they're all changing. Jason Frank, in terms of the information provider, in his article said that any teacher whose identity and efforts involve little more than conveying information are already doing less than technology can. So we're no longer simply an information provider. The dean at Flinders, Paul Worley, at a meeting of the International Association of Medical Science Educators in San Diego, stood up in front of all the basic science teachers, and he pulled out his iPhone, and said, look, in this iPhone are all the students need to know about biochemistry, physiology, and anatomy, and they're probably better given lectures, better information available than this, than all the lectures you're giving. You're giving a waste of time just standing up giving your lectures in these subjects. Use your time to much more facilitate learning and help the students solve problems. All the information is here. Your role is no longer as simply an information provider. You're no longer just a conductor of transmitted information. You should be a curator helping students guide the information and coaching them, as Chuck Freeman said, on how to find information for themselves. So our role as teachers is changing in all of these roles. And we probably should be aware of all of these roles, but have special input in some of them. So these are the key elements I see in the Industrial Revolution. The move to much more personalized learning, the continuing move to more outcome-based education, where what is fixed is not time, but standards. A move to breaking down the barriers to think of lifelong learning of our students, to unbundling the curriculum, to sharing, not being self-sufficient, to work in collaboration with other schools, to recognize the importance of students, and we need a new generation of students who can learn for themselves, and our own changing role as teachers. Now, some of these challenges may be very difficult and may seem impossible for us to take. But I think these do represent significant changes that we should be engaging in our curriculum. I wanted perhaps to introduce one further change, perhaps a more fundamental change, perhaps a new model of how we practice medicine. And again, if you read the articles in Industrial Revolution, it talks about this. What sort of doctor should we have? How doctors and patients can win the 4th Industrial Revolution. It talks about, it's not just the technology that matters, it's the system, rather than technologies. So what sort of system, what sort of doctor do we want? And not just the technologies. We must change how we educate and train the future workshop. What sort of doctor should we be training? What sort of doctor should we be training? A new world that demands new doctors in the 4th Industrial Revolution. And Stephen Wingard and David Gordon said, medical education has a regrettable history of producing doctors fit for the past. doctors perhaps for the present, but not doctors for the future. So the challenge, are we training doctors for the future? And what sort of doctors should we be training? Even the very conservative House of Lords in the UK have been looking at this, saying, what sort of doctors should we be training? Is the training time too long? They'll be asking. Training may need to be shorter. What sort of doctors should we be training? And this came to my mind when having a conversation over dinner. And I was talking with an ENT surgeon. And the ENT surgeon said to me, look, now I'm a very experienced ENT surgeon. It took me 15 years to train to be an ENT surgeon. I'm doing now spent all my life doing about 3 operations. I could probably learn to do this in about 3 years, or maybe a little bit longer. Did I really need to spend 15 years of my life learning to do these 3 operations? There's a dermatologist there as well who said exactly the same. Was all this time really necessary? You know, the traditional program, the time may vary a little, but in general, if you put together undergraduate, postgraduate training, it takes about 13 years to train a specialist. The question, is that appropriate? Can we have a different model, other different training options? Should we be training specialist doctors from the word go? Specialist doctors who will become the ENT surgeon or the orthopedic surgeon or the dermatologist. We have a broad general training program, specialist training, then ultra specialist program. And we can probably do that, probably conservatively in 7 years. And I calculated if we did this, even in Europe, we save about 50 billion euros a year if we did such a training program. And then we'd have the diagnostician therapist who had the full extent of program. So do we want these 2 sorts of doctors? Something, again, we need to at least think about and discuss. Interesting, this hospital in Toronto, all they do is hernia repairs. All they do is hernia repairs. And they've got the best records in the world. Infinitely better records in all aspects of hernia repair. And I said to him, you don't get bored doing it? I said, no, this is exciting because we're trying to keep perfecting what we're doing. And again, they said, look, we didn't need 15 years to train to be doing what we're now doing. And we're now the best in the world doing it. So do we need to think again about this? So I hope we're not going for the status quo. I hope we're not going for modest change. I've suggested some of the significant change that we should be looking for. And perhaps should we at least be having a discussion, thinking about what fundamental change, what sort of doctor should we be training? I said in the title, in the last bit of it, how do we get the nut out of the tube? And this was an interesting experiment, and it showed the challenge was to get this nut out of the tube. And it was unsuccessful because they didn't make use of all the facilities. No one succeeded. And then they gave the challenge to a monkey who had a rather inventive solution, realizing that you could float the nut up out of the tube. But then he didn't have quite enough urine to do so. He thought he would try, however, did he have, but it wasn't quite successful. So then he realized he needed more resources to help him to do this. He went away and he found some water and came back and with the water filled up the tube and then got the nut out. Now, the point was that all of the others doing this had all the resources there. The water was there for them, but they didn't use it. So the water was on the table behind them, and they didn't make use of the resources. They could have floated the nut out, but no one did it because they didn't think. They said, this is an impossible task, they all concluded. And many of these things we're talking about in the Industrial Revolution, these 6 things, many feel are not possible. And my challenge is that if we think about the resources we have, this monkey in the tube, we may actually be able to do what we thought previously was impossible. Because I think we have to move in this direction. We have to make this leap. And I wanted just to end with a quote from Odin, a single verse.
The sense of danger must not disappear. The way is certainly both short and steep, however gradual it looks from here. Look if you like, but you will have to leap.
So we all have to leap in the future, and whether you follow these suggestions I have about the fourth industrial revolution, or this meeting may come to different conclusions, the future is there, and we all have to leap. Thank you.